Welcome to the Trouble with Writing podcast, where we chat about the real issues that stop multilingual writers producing effective English and see where we can help. Hi, Phil. Hi, Paul. How are you guys this week?
Great, Pete. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, good, thanks. September, so we're into autumn here, back to school, back to work. Everything's kicking off here in Spain again. What's it like in Chile?
Yeah, so we're into spring. We've really noticed the change in weather. It was quite chilly in Chile before, and now it's much nicer. And yeah, busy as usual, to be honest. What about in Canada, Paul?
Yeah, where I live, it's still sunny and warm, but the leaves will start turning color and it'll cool off in the next couple of weeks as we head toward, October. But it's a nice time of year in Vancouver on the west coast of Canada. Doesn't get too cool, so it's pretty pleasant. I like it. And there's some great cultural events like the Vancouver Film Festival that kicks off. So it's a good time of year for anyone interested in the arts or humanities.
It always feels like a new start, a new beginning, September.
Truly.
Because, most of us are still affiliated with the academic year, and even apartment rentals and things like that here in Las Palmas. We have a lot of Europeans coming to stay for the winter, so it's like the season is really kicking off, and everything still revolves around that back to school year, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely to me always feels more like the new year than January 1st does. January 1st comes, nothing really changes. We're still in the winter. School has just had a 2-week break or something. But this time of year always feels very different. Things are really ramping up. I've taken on several new students. So yeah, things are animating. How about where you are, Phil? Pete?
Yes, I mean, here we've actually just had the national festival to celebrate Independence Day in Chile. So it's like a little holiday, and then we're already into the second semester before that. So it's just kind of, we have this little break and then get the ball rolling again, really.
Great. Yeah.
All right. Well, maybe we shouldn't chat for too long. We should keep it concise, because that's what we're talking about today.
Exactly. Yeah.
How writers can reduce the words on the page to make their text and their writing more concise and effective. We like that, especially in English. Mm-hmm. Who wants to kick us off? Why is English such a concise language compared to others?
Yeah. So, I mean, for example, I have a lot of students who are their first language is Romance languages like Spanish, Italian, and French. And when they start writing in English, it's something that they really notice the difference. How in their language, they often use longer sentences, more wordier phrases. So then when it comes to writing in English, it's something that they really notice the difference. And this is why we're doing this episode today, because it's going to really help a lot of students.
Yeah, I think those are really important considerations for students when they're moving their thought and communication into English. They do notice, my students definitely notice a difference in the English they hear and read compared to their own language. And, they're in that stage where they may still be translating their ideas from their language into English and realizing how different it ends up. And I think this is, language is an aspect of culture that communicates cultural values and aesthetics. And I think it captures that in, especially in written form. And give you an example, with my South American students, I often hear them say, "Oh, South Americans are so warm and outgoing and passionate, and Westerners like British and Canadians and Americans are so cold and reserved. And I have an issue with the metaphor of cold and hot, because one is intrinsically positive and one's intrinsically negative. But their point is taken, right? But I think that the language is a dimension of that culture. For example, if someone's reserved in speech, it doesn't make them less passionate, right? They may work really hard at something. We may be really dedicated to our students. It doesn't make us less passionate, but fewer words may sound less passionate. So I always find it fascinating how they observe this difference, but it's such a profound difference, isn't it? Do you have that same experience, Phil?
Yeah, I hear you. I have similar experiences to you both, I think. I guess a point I thought about adding is that we are writing in quite different ways now. You know, you think of Alexandre Dumas or Charles Dickens. They wrote page-long descriptions of what somebody was wearing or what a character could see. And nowadays, the style of fiction, especially in English, is much more direct and getting the reader to do more work and imagine things. And the same with digital writing. Most of the internet is still comprised of English, and so much of the digital writing that we write and consume has to be really concise to hold the attention of people through the 5 seconds that they look at something before they scroll. So I think extra reasons there to consider that less is often more in English, especially with more modern writing.
It seems like those things have influenced that too, right? The need for concision in copy and content. But also I wonder how much influence, well, if you think of writers that were impactful like Hemingway, who espoused a really terse style of writing, very concise writing. But also I wonder how much influence Asiatic languages have had as we've become more globalized. We're all influenced not just by our Western European based aesthetic culture and communicative culture and literary culture. We're also influenced by other languages and other peoples like Chinese or Japanese, which has a very different style of writing that doesn't require a lot of words because they have characters. I don't know. What do you think has influenced this move toward writing more concisely, specifically, Pete? Any ideas or any experience with that?
Well, I was just going to say that, complementing what Phil said, I think it can also depend on the style in fiction, right? So different writers have different styles. Some are more direct, some are less direct. It could also depend on genres of writing, right? So in journalism, writers are supposed to be more direct, certainly in English journalism, definitely more concise. In other genres of writing, there might be less of an emphasis on being concise. That might not be the most important thing, right? I mean, what about in academic writing, Phil? Paul, is being concise one of the most important things, or is it not as important as other aspects? What do you think?
I think it's extremely important because the function of academic writing is to explain a point to a reader. It's very reader-centered forms of writing. And the reader reads it for a purpose. They're trying to understand a study, a report, an opinion, an argument, and they really need to understand the idea. And I think there's a tendency when writers are learning to write academic writing that they're bringing over some of the skills they've learned in creative writing or just sort of more generalized writing in classroom or school. And here's the sort of wall that my students run into. I'll get an initial sample from them, and I'll recommend removing, 20% of the words, and they'll say, "Teacher, then I'm not saying anything." And then I'll say, "Okay, you've deleted the unnecessary, but now, especially if you have a word count or a word limit, but now you've got more space to add the elaboration that's necessary for academic writing. We don't want a lot of words. We want a lot of content. We want a lot of idea. We want a lot of elaboration on your point." And that's a struggle that I find I'm always negotiating with them, because they've sort of, I think as students learn the language, the first challenge is to make a sentence, right? Then they're struggling to make a paragraph. So until they're really advanced learners, they're struggling to fill the page or to write an idea fully. But then they get to a certain point where you got to reel that in a bit and encourage them to write more concisely and elaborate their ideas with more depth, more complexity. So that's where I'm always finding my relationships with the students, is in that sort of zone of moving away from just trying to fill the page with a lot of writing, a lot of words, and then scaling that back and filling it with more ideas and complexity. Pete, does that ring true for journalism as well?
Yeah. So one thing that's really interesting there, comparing the two genres, right, academic writing and journalism, is maybe the relationship between being concise and being more or less concrete, right? So what I would ask you about, is that a challenge in academic writing, just because academic writing is often associated with, maybe not always fairly, but part of the time, being more abstract, and also depending on the audience. If you have an academically specialized audience, sometimes the language could be more formal, right? And then how does that affect being concise?
Yeah, good point. I think it goes back to something we touched on earlier, which is one of the differences with English. I think what English has going for it, I consider it an advantage, is that English is made of not just English. It's made of French influence, Germanic influence. So it's absorbed a lot of words, and it's resulted in an enormous vocabulary. There's an enormous vocabulary available to an English user. And so if you can eliminate a sentence and replace it with a word and express the same meaning, that seems worthwhile, and it's possible with English. And so with academic writing, and this is where my students always have this, they always encounter this in the movement from a first draft to a second. In the first draft, they're just struggling to articulate the idea. And then as we work into the second draft, I'll make suggestions about how to take that idea that they managed to put into 2 or 3 sentences and show them ways to make that more concise, because the reader wants to get to the point quicker, because there's another point waiting, right? There's other information we have to get to. So sometimes, as you mentioned, there's a sort of insularity. If you're writing in an engineering paper, it's got its own sort of insular jargon. And if you're writing in things like philosophy or the humanities, you tend toward the abstract. So it is a challenge to use the vocabulary to be more concrete and more clear. Is that also true, Phil, with content writing and copywriting?
Yeah, such a good point about replacing a sentence with a word. I really like that, because one of the things I try to impart to people who are writing a blog or an article is, don't fill your word count with an unnecessary sentence or a point. That's what is seen as sort of lazy writing, or it's the reader is wandering off, because if each sentence isn't holding our attention, then we wander off. And what you can do is split points out. So you can just separate all the points that you're making in your 600-word article, and put them line by line go through each one individually and ask questions about it. Say, should this be here? And if the answer is it's repeated or it's not adding anything, you can include it in another point, right? There might be one bit of extra information, one word or one phrase that you can just add into another sentence. So not only are you making the work more concise, but you're making that original sentence a bit richer. So that can work really well. And I think, it definitely applies that each point should be valid, and the reader's waiting for that next point.
I liken it a little bit to watching a movie sometimes. I use a movie plot as an analogy, and sometimes it helps the student grasp what I'm trying to encouraging them. If you're watching a movie and something happens, you immediately wonder what will happen next. The drama is created and the suspense is created. You immediately wonder what will happen next. You don't want to see the same thing happen again, right? You don't want that redundancy unless it's necessary for the plot. It's the same thing when you read something, especially something purposeful like an academic paper. We want to get to the next point. So just like a movie, I'll encourage my students to make every sentence bring a new idea into the conversation. So I read one sentence and I get to the full stop. Okay, what will happen next? What am I going to hear next? The worst possible thing is for the same idea to be repeated. Is that kind of what you're also talking about, Phil? Like,
yeah, this is more relevant to copywriting and content writing and maybe a story. But I call that the so what test, which is you read a sentence, and if you can say so what, people are not excited for the next sentence. It hasn't generated any curiosity. So if you say, I am a particularly tall person, it's like, so what? But you say that you're so tall you banged your head on the door frame, then you probably can't say so what, what happened, or that must have been annoying. So maybe those aren't the best examples, but the so what test is something you can apply and just get that reader to the next point. Pete, what do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And then I would also add that, and this is also true of more like literary journalism, or basically whenever you're telling a story, right? You want to also generate that intrigue, that excitement for the reader to want to go on to the next sentence, right? So you're like earning that from the reader, and you can do things like ask questions. Right? So you can finish a sentence with a question, so then that the reader wants to know the answer, so they will go on to the next sentence. Right? So you can have these little hooks at the end of sentences, right, to generate that intrigue.
I think that's a really key insight that I've also espoused, Pete. I think sometimes with less experienced writers that I work with, they'll say something in a line that raises a question for the reader. And when I go through their work and read it, I note that. I say, what question pops up in my mind? And I'll put a note there. And I'll wait to see if they actually address it. If they offer an explanation or an answer to that question that's been raised. Because if they don't, I feel frustrated as a reader, and their eventual reader will feel frustrated and dissatisfied, and then they'll just pull out, right? You have to be mindful of the questions and the hooks that you're generating for a reader.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's when you're writing, you want to actually imagine that you're having a conversation with your reader while you're writing. So you're imagining. So you're writing something, and you're imagining what questions your reader might have, right? And then you make sure that you answer those questions. Right?
That's right. Sometimes when I have an academic essay the student is working on, I'll go through their main points in their outline, their main pieces of argument. and I'll just generate a massive list of questions that statement, that claim raises for me. Like if they say something like, I don't know, the government should lower taxes because they're too high. Okay, whatever. I could generate 50 questions from that. Specific questions. Why is that necessary? How can that happen? When should this happen? Who should be responsible for all those questions that come to mind? And I want answers for that stuff, right? So, guys, I guess a question I have, because my students will certainly ask this question, is how can they make their writing more concise? We've talked about why it's necessary, why it's important, how it may differ culture to culture, but maybe we should think about actual techniques. What do you think about that, Phil?
Yeah, I mean, well, I touched on it a couple of minutes ago, saying start big. With a lot of editing techniques and improvement for writing, I think it's best to start big and then get smaller. So you don't start with editing full stops and changing commas. You start asking questions about if all the content should be there and if it's the right length. And one key way to really reduce extra points which aren't necessary is to do what I mentioned, is to break out your points individually and make sure, as you said, that all of the questions we have about them are answered. But if they are, if they're relevant, I think that's the first thing to ask. And if they're not relevant, obviously delete them. And the second thing to ask would be, are they worthwhile? Which is a slightly different question, because you can have something which is on topic, a point which is on topic, but it's not adding something essential and key to your writing. After that, you might want to think about the order and put things in order, and that's where you might combine points to make them even more concise as well. So I'd say that's a good area to start. And if you really want to reduce 1,000 words to 800, let's say, then that's probably the easiest way to do it, is by getting rid of sections that don't belong.
Pete, does that ring true for your work as well?
Yeah, I was just going to add something to what Phil said. I totally agree with that. Sometimes you can cut out the beginning, cut out the end. So sometimes writers, they sometimes take a little bit long to get going, right? They have a lot of context, and the reader's yeah, okay, but I want to get to the point, right? So sometimes when you're editing, right, you're rereading your work to edit it, you can consider maybe chopping the beginning part or part of it. And also the end, that can also happen, right? So you've the main story is over, right? You've reached the climax, it's gone. And then sometimes a writer might just keep writing the end part, how they lived happily ever after and blah, 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 blah. And sometimes you can cut at least part of that too. That can be a way to be more concise.
Yeah, I agree with both those things, and definitely find the same strategies very helpful. In fact, when I teach academic writers, I'll start with an outline and then encourage them to start writing the actual prose directly at the first body paragraph. Skip the introduction, because I think a lot of young writers get so bogged down in the introduction, they can't write a proper introduction because they don't know what they're introducing. Right? It's like introducing a stranger that you met on the bus that you don't even know their name. Introduce that person to your friend and saying, hey, I've got a perfect girlfriend for you. She's, I know nothing about her. So I always get them to write the essay first. And now you know what you're going to introduce, then write the introduction. But I also think what you're also sketching out here is this idea that the first stage is to get all the ideas out, right? And get to the points. And in the editing phase, and also teaching them how to separate those stages. In the editing phase, you trim and make it smaller. And then they start panicking, saying, well, what am I saying? But now they've created all this opportunity for things that are missing, ideas that are missing, that can be fleshed out. I think when you pare things down, suddenly you realize, what is missing here? What part of the argument or what part of the story did you not consider earlier? But now you can visibly see the whole, because we've removed a lot of the fluff that may be concealing that whole.
Yeah, I was smiling at what Pete was saying with cutting the beginning, because I think Anton Chekhov said that his writing advice was to cut the first third or cut the first quarter of a story, of a short story especially. And it's so true. It's something I've done in the past. You get, a couple of pages in and you're like, yeah, actually here is where the start of the story is. I mean, it doesn't ring true for all writing, like academic writing and blogs. You need a little introduction. You need to say, here's what's coming up. But I think that's a nice idea, Paul, starting or dealing with that introduction last, because
absolutely
it's functional. It's not the content. So start with the content, keep that concise, and then you won't ramble on in the introduction either.
I find once they've established the content, even in first draft form, they know what they are going to introduce, but now they can answer the question, why the hell are we talking about this? Which is why you need an introduction, right? If you walk up to a stranger at a bus stop and out of the blue say, I think the government should lower taxes, they're going to say, okay, interesting point, but why the hell are you telling me this? That's what the introduction's for. Establish from where the idea arises, who and what is involved, and all the context that makes this argument necessary or makes this topic necessary to discuss. But you don't know that until you've really written it. And I think a lot of writers, including creative writers and fiction writers that I've worked with, they use the introduction or the first pages of a story to figure out what they're going to write. It's basically brainstorming, which can be done in a different way. Pete, you also find with journalists that they get bogged down in the early parts of the story and need that to be excised?
Yeah, it can happen. Just building on what you were saying there. I think in your genre, what you specialize in, it's in the plan, isn't it? That's when you're brainstorming in the plan, right?
Yeah.
And also there, you're going to first think about the main ideas, before you think about the introduction, like what you said.
Yeah.
For journalists, I wanted to give a couple of tips. So, once you've you got your main ideas on the page, right? Once you get to you're rereading, you're editing, and then I wanted to look at a few more specific aspects. So for journalists, two things are you want to be concise and also lively, right? You want energy in your writing, right? What you want to avoid is being abstract. You want to avoid sounding, even sometimes a little pompous. If you have a lot of abstract nouns in your writing, you can sound like you're trying to be clever, right? And you have to consider that, if you're writing for a broad audience, then, you want your writing to be accessible for everyone. So one thing to think about is to avoid unnecessary abstract nouns. So, a few examples, words like conditions, activity, purpose, character, problem, issue. Some of these words can be very abstract, and a lot of the time you can actually just take them out. So I have here 3 examples. Right? The first one, he uses the phone for work purposes. Right? Just take out purposes. Say, he uses the phone for work. It's enough, right? Purposes doesn't really add anything significant, right? Or they did some physical activity, right? Why not just say they played sport, right? Something much more specific, right? You don't need the word activity there. And one more could be the house was of a friendly character, right? This construction of a X character is so unnecessary. It's just a wordy phrase, right? Just say the house was friendly, Right? It's enough. Yeah. So that would be the first tip. And the second tip would be, to use verbs instead of these nominalized forms. Right? When you use nominalized forms, so basically, nouns made from verbs or adjectives, that's when your writing can become abstract and can become wordy, right? It can, even bore people, right? You don't want to do that. You want energy. You want to be lively, right? Just two examples. So the first one, the cinema has seating accommodation for 500, right? Seating accommodation. Why not just use a verb, right? The cinema seats 500, right? So you don't need this has seating accommodation for. Look how many words we're wasting there, right? Yeah. Just one more. The company gives permission to its employees to work from home. Instead of saying gives permission to, that's three words, right? You could just use one verb, right? The company allows its employees to work from home, right? So yeah, just avoiding these wordy phrases, these abstract nouns, and you can be so much more concise, so much livelier in your writing, and avoid sending people to sleep.
Yeah,
Brilliant.
I think that's where English is so flexible, because so many of the words in English have several forms, and if multilingual writers can really get to know the different forms, like what was your example, permits and permission.
Exactly.
If you can understand that, hey, that can be a verb as well, that's how you can be a lot more concise. And yeah, I really liked that point about sounding clever. I think many writers from around the world might not realize that when they're using phrases which have more words in them, like these nominalized forms, readers are thinking, who the hell are you? Are you some college professor? Are you trying to appear as if you're getting published in an academic journal? They just may be translating words directly, but in fact, those forms are much more academic sounding. So yeah, Paul, what do you have to say on that?
I think it's spot on, and it's unnecessary, because I think what happens is young people go to university and they're trying to impress the professor with what they think is, verbose, academic, lofty sounding writing. And we've all been students, so we understand there is that motivation to get a good mark and impress the professor. But at a certain point, you're going to impress the professor with great writing, concise writing being great writing. And if you become a professor, and I've worked with some professors who write in English as their second language, and to be a great academic writer, someone who gets published, or even better, someone who becomes a world famous author and leaves academia altogether and becomes lecture tour speaker or writer, they have the ability to take those lofty ideas and make them accessible to people. That's great academic writing, not impressing your peers, but providing, clear understanding of extremely complex topics. That's the nature of academic work, is exploring complex ideas. But if you can do that in an accessible way, you become a better academic writer, in my opinion. So that, to me, is the goal, is writing your complex opinions and ideas, but very clearly. And I don't encourage my students to wait until they become professors to do that. I start teaching them how to do that from the beginning, because I also think that will give them better marks in university if they're at that stage, because professors will get their point. The professor really just wants to understand the idea that they're demonstrating, and writing concisely is the key to that. And all of those techniques you pointed out, Pete, are absolutely spot on. Even in academic writing, those are essential. Sometimes a specific word is unavoidable, right? Sometimes a crazy abstract technical term is unavoidable because it is the right choice. It's the precise choice. But if you have to use that crazy big lofty word, then all the stuff around it should be concise, you know? So I always try to encourage that balance. If you have to use this big crazy word, let's trim all the other stuff. Let's make that verb active, right? Let's get rid of some of that prepositional stuff. Another thing that I also point out, just another little tip, and I think this all points to a philosophy that I'm always espousing, which is one word is better than two in English, and two words is better than three, and so on. I kind of put that above your desk is what I tell all my students. But for example, a lot of students will use negative phrasing, like, you will not appreciate the details that lack relevance. You will not. Well, not is just one extra word you can avoid. Plus, it creates a negative space, an absence. How do you not do something, right? It's easier to grasp when you can use a positive, like, instead of, you will not appreciate the details that lack relevance, how about, you will appreciate relevant details, right? Just reducing it down in number. Does that kind of technique also hold true in your work, Phil?
I think it's to do with language. I mean, I encounter that especially with Spanish and Portuguese speakers. They phrase a lot of things with this double negative way, and we're a bit allergic to double negatives in English because they don't make grammatical sense. So that if we have two in a sentence, it really makes us think, what's going on here? Mm-hmm. And I think it makes it less clear as well as uses more words. So yeah, it's definitely something I encounter. Pete's nodding as well.
Yeah, no, it's true for journalists too, right? It's always the advice, avoid negatives, use positive language if you can. It keeps the language, again, more concise, livelier, clearer, definitely.
It's like, sorry, I just want to interject one quick thing. I have a friend who recently had a child, and he was reading, child raising books to become a better father. One of the things that he learned was that when you give a child advice, don't give him negative advice. Don't say, don't step on that thing. Instead, tell them where they should step, because you can't act on a negative. You can only act on a positive instruction. I thought that's also applicable to language. Sorry to cut you off, Phil.
Yeah, no, interesting point. I was just going to say we've talked about a few systems or approaches or groups of words that we can cut out, right? Like these prepositional phrases, long-winded phrases, I suppose, like on that day or at that time. Mm-hmm. Those can go. I'd add a few other groups of words that all of our listeners can immediately cut out because they really don't add much. Things like modifiers, very or completely or quite. There's probably a more precise word choice that you can use. Yeah. In fact, in fiction writing, adverbs are a real no-no in more modern types of literature. So, yeah, a lot of adverbs, and you can even do on your documents a Control F search for find and look for these things, right? Look for very, look for what's some other things that we use to qualify, like just or kind of or actually.
Pretty much.
A lot of those. I mean, yeah, we can find them and just eliminate them. Look for ly. You'll find adverbs. Look for your just, very, and any other ticks that you notice that your writing has, maybe that your editor or mentor or tutor has said to remove, and just get rid of those. Have you guys got any other particular sets of words?
I was just going to complement that by saying if you use a strong verb, right, then you don't need an adverb, right?
I also think I'm right behind you on that. I always telling them to just cut all that stuff out because it's subjective. right? If you think something is very beautiful, what does that really mean? How can a reader picture that? I'd rather have a description than um, modifiers like that, and intensifiers like very and really and just. There's a better word to be found somewhere, right? And it's really a question of finding the right word.
That's the real difference between writing and speaking. When we speak, we don't have time to formulate the perfect words. So there's so much repetition, and we say things like very beautiful because we don't have the space and the time to concoct that perfect combination of words. But that's where I suppose in a lot of the writers that I work with want to sound conversational. So sometimes they'll use conversational words, but definitely being mindful of what you're writing is important, because if it isn't, an email to a customer or a social media post or something, then those kind of words really shouldn't be appearing.
I think also some words or some of those modifiers only work in speech because we can deliver them with different tonality, right? The most common one I encounter is the word so. Like in conversation, you can say, "Oh my God, the Justin Bieber concert was so awesome." But if you write that, it lacks that intensity. It just says the concert was so awesome. Well, how much is so? I mean, for that matter, how much is awesome, right? It's already subjective with that adjective, and when you add so, it doesn't elevate it in any way that's discernible to a reader. But those are conversational habits that really don't translate into the written word.
Yeah, we're also moving into the territory of word choice, right? So, words like great, awesome, they're just overused, right? So they start to lose some of their meaning, right? But like you say, when we're speaking, that's fine because we don't have time to think. So we're going to, use the words that we use the most. They're going to be the first words to come to mind. When we're writing, we can take more time to really find those stronger, more meaningful verbs, nouns, adjectives, whatever. And then by doing that, we can avoid using unnecessary adverbs, modifiers, etc.
And question for you guys. Sorry, Phil, go ahead.
I was just going to make a very quick point about when we speak, some of the expressions that we use are playful and fun and include extra words, things like each and every or safe and sound. That's one I came across the other day. It's quite nice when we're speaking because they have a sound technique and
there's a rhythm.
And there's the double aspect, each and every. But when we're writing, those are ones to watch out for because one of those is redundant, right? If you're saying each, just use each. If each and every, just use each. Same with something like close proximity. You might say that, but it's close. We don't need the proximity. Or in proximity, just use one. So watch out for those like redundant pairs that we often use when we are speaking.
Speaking is really, it's a very different form. And even in daily conversation, I think there's a musicality, a poetry that we love to hear. And it often involves repetition or redundancy because those are poetic forms. Something that just popped up. I don't know I can't remember if you guys are sports fans. Do you guys watch football? Follow it? Or
if by football you mean
soccer?
Yes.
Yeah.
Soccer for you, right?
Yeah. And I don't follow soccer, by the way. I follow North American style football with throwing. But I wonder if this is true in the world of your football. A lot of the broadcasters in the sports are former players, so we're not expecting professorial conversation. But when they're talking about things, there's so much redundancy that I as a sports fan, I struggle to take my teacher hat off. But they'll say things like, "Yeah, he's a really good player on the football field." Well, the whole show is about football. We know where they play. We know that he's a player. Why can't you just say he's a great player? Or they'll say he's an excellent player on the offensive side of the football. Offensive side of the football?
Yeah.
Why can't you just say he's a great offense player or he's a great quarterback? Because everyone who watches that knows that that's an offensive. Anyways, that if you want to hear redundancy or lack of concision, sports broadcast, is it true for soccer broadcasts?
I mean, I don't know if Pete agrees, but I think British football pundits and commentators are maybe not so much commentators, but certainly the pundits and sportscasters are guilty of cliches. Almost everything they say is, oh, he needs to get his head in the game. It's a game of two halves. So he's had an absolute nightmare. You know, it's just all these cliches that have rolled out, and none of them really mean anything, but just filling space with things that people won't disagree with, but they're not really creating a meaning with what they're saying.
Yeah.
Do you agree?
I think though, that's I think these cliches, they can get away with it in broadcasting, right? In writing though, they can't. It's like in writing, you know, you read all these cliches and then it gets boring after a while. So I would definitely agree and just say that it's in writing where it becomes really important.
Even in the realm of sports, in sports writing, sports journalism, there's some excellent writing to be read. I just used a redundancy. Writing to be read. What else is it for? But there's some great writing about sports. So it's the speech act where they feel the need that the sentence doesn't feel complete until it has a couple more beats. There's a real musicality to speech. I think I'm guilty of it when I talk. Sometimes you say something and it's concise and the meaning is present, but you feel like there's a missing top hat and snare drum there or something. I don't know. It's an odd compulsion in speech for people to speak. I don't know. Even when the sentence is done.
It's a really interesting topic that we could probably spend a whole episode on, rhythm and flow and musicality, because it exists in writing too, because when we read something, our internal voice is saying it. So we hear writing as much as, read it, but of course it is processed in a different way to speech. So I guess the production of it is quite different, but the way we consume it is more similar. I don't know in terms of hearing the words.
Maybe that's a good topic for another day.
Yeah, this is why. So just to finish that point, this is why like when you've written something, it's really good to get someone else to read it to you, right? Just to see what it sounds like. Does it sound natural? Does it flow? Does it have rhythm?
Do you guys ever encounter a writer who doesn't want to follow your editing suggestions to be more concise because they'll claim that, well, that's the way I speak. I want my voice to be heard in the writing. Does that ever come up? Like you're changing their voice or denying their voice?
It's something I think about quite a lot, because especially with fiction writing, with less functional writing, it's important that people can keep their own voice and that they do have something to add other than precise technical use of English. I'd still make the point that if they are function words which are cluttering a sentence, little prepositions and things, you can't argue that that's your voice. Those words have no meaning. They're there to serve a purpose in a sentence. If I'm asking you to change a verb or an expression which you think is important to how you express a thought, then I think writers have the right to push back a bit. I guess a lot of what we've talked about today is how to get rid of those little cluttering words.
I think you've just touched on one tip I would also add for writing more concisely is to avoid those kind of flat verb expressions, especially with be verbs, like when people say there is a dog in the park. Avoiding those there is or it is imperative. Getting rid of the be verb and using a more active verb, or taking that verb, that noun like imperative, if there's a verb form, and using it. Rather than there is a dog, you can say a dog walks across the park or something. It also creates more engagement for the reader, I think, because there's action that they can imagine rather than sort of these sort of lifeless verbs. Any other tips, guys, about how to write more concisely?
I was just going to, I was just going to, agree with what Phil was saying, and add there that one thing is having your own personal style as a writer, but another thing is you have to think about your reader and not have unnecessary fluff in your writing that doesn't really add anything, doesn't really add any significant meaning.
Yeah, the reader isn't going to put up with fluff, so they won't care about your voice if they put your book down or put your magazine down, right?
That's right.
I think I'd make the point about ungrammatical sentences, like sentence fragments, can be very impactful and useful in writing, which is for more entertainment purposes. So it could be creative writing, it could be something like a social media post. You'll see a lot of sentence fragments. I think they're great and can have a lot of impact. You need to know how much you can use them. Like any technique, don't overuse it. You don't want to write a post which is almost all sentence fragments. I'm just going to read a very quick, short story, which is 10 words. Don't worry, it's not a long one. I know Hemingway seems to pop up quite a lot, and he's got a famous 6-word story, but most people know that. So I thought I'd just choose another one that I found. And I'll have to look up who the writer is and put it in the show notes because I don't have it here. But it's something I found online, and the story goes as follows. Back in Antigua, mezcal on the rocks, waiting for her. Back in Antigua, mezcal on the rocks, waiting for her. 3 fragments there, 3 sentence fragments, which really expand. Each of those expands hugely. Back in Antigua is 3 words, but we can understand from that where someone is, that they've returned, that it's important, and that's why they're telling us that. Mezcal on the rocks, well, we know what somebody is doing, and we might be asking questions about why they're drinking mezcal on the rocks. And waiting for her, that kicks off a whole backstory and a possible future as well. Mm-hmm. So I think sentence fragments can be very expansive in English, and can also be impactful if used in the right context and in the right quantity.
Love it.
Yeah.
Very evocative.
I was just going to say that that could be a challenge for some writers who they might have learned to write in English, learn a more academic style, where they've been taught at school to always use a subject and a verb, have a complete sentence, and then the challenge is to understand what you're saying, Phil, that actually other genres, so in less formal writing, in journalism, in creative writing, you can use fragments. You don't always have to have a subject, a verb. So that's a challenge, I think, to make that transition.
And how can writers do that, do you think? Is it through reading and analysis of what they're trying to produce?
Yeah, I always advise, always recommend, reading, noticing, is a really important first step. And then, in the practice stage, getting the feedback, and then, analyzing and saying, hey, look, you don't actually need, you don't need a subject here, or you don't need, understanding that you can take grammatical, functional words out sometimes and turn it into a fragment. If that is the style of that genre.
It's a good question, though. I wonder if English education is doing enough to introduce various genres to learners so that they can compare the differences and the liberties you can take with one which don't work in another. I encounter a lot of students who write in fragments, especially my Brazilian students. And I often ask them, are you allowed to do that in Portuguese? And they'll say, oh, no. But what they're doing is they're trying to mimic the way they speak, right? That's a challenge. But I wonder if education could do a better job of, cross-genre examination. I think we do that. We do so through our life, but I don't know. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's definitely more needs to be done there. So, I mean, thinking about, general classes, so general English as a foreign language, firstly, quite often there's not even enough work done on writing skills at all, right?
Sure.
So let alone, different genres of writing. You'd be lucky if you learn to write an email, write an academic essay. So yeah, I'd definitely say that there, it's not specialized enough. I think firstly, there's not enough work often just on general writing, let alone more specialized writing in different genres.
I mean, I'd go further than Pete and say it's hideously out of date. I mean, think about IELTS letters. Write a proposal to your councilman or something. It's like who does that? I mean, the technology's not there to actually assess and utilize digital forms to write in big English classes. I mean, I hope it does get there, but so many of the textbooks are woefully disconnected with the reality of writing. It's not a surprise, Paul, that you have some students coming who really don't understand the difference between a WhatsApp message and an email and a social media post. They're all different and they're all very important to us nowadays, but very few people are given instruction on it in English classes, and very few people are given even training on it after university. So I hope it's something we can rectify.
Yeah, I try to with my students when they say, even if they really want to just focus on their speaking ability in English, I'll always incorporate reading and writing into that because they all feed together. And so they'll say, teacher, what should I read? And I'll just say, read everything. Read everything that's in front of you. Read the back of a soda can. Read the label on a food product. Read a magazine. Read a newsletter. Read a brochure that's stuffed in your mailbox. Get an appreciation of the landscape of different genres that are right in front of you in your world. Read social media. Read the news. Compare that to a short story or I just encourage them to read anything. You buy a soccer ball, read the text that's on the ball. Why is it like that? Why is it this? Why is it that? Even in speech, they struggle with where things belong and where things are appropriate. I always find it comical when students try out their new English and they're using all kinds of swearing and curse language and sometimes really offensive language in just everyday conversation because they haven't been taught that's not appropriate for business or that's not appropriate for school. That belongs in the bar or out on the pitch, and I'll tell them, look, I'm a human. When I get together with my friends over a pint, we curse like sailors. But you're not going to hear me say that kind of stuff in a classroom. You have to be able to switch that stuff. But that's a bit off topic, but maybe it's been a while since I went to a place for a pint.
Hey, should we wrap up with some takeaways?
Takeaways.
Good idea. Take it away.
Take it away, Pete.
Yeah. Okay. So basically, my main takeaway for journalists: avoid unnecessary abstract nouns, favor verbs over nouns, keep your writing concise, keep it lively.
My takeaway for content writers would be to start big, think big in terms of what you should definitely keep in your piece. Make sure that every point is relevant, every point is worthwhile. That's a way that you can make work initially more concise before you get into the nitty-gritty of editing and some of the words to avoid and phrases to avoid that we talked about.
I think my takeaway is pretty much along the same lines: avoiding fluffy words, modifiers you don't need. Try to replace them with a single, more precise vocabulary choice. Try to avoid vague expressions. Again, opting for a precise choice. Avoiding negative expressions if you can replace it with a better positive one that's more brief. What else? Always making the next sentence adding to the idea rather than repeating it or trying to reinforce it. If you say it clearly once, you do not need to repeat it. Trust your reader. And by doing so, you'll engage the reader better, even at the academic level. And if you have to use a specific technical word, use it, but then try to trim the rest of it so that it stands on its own, but the rest of it's cleaner. Those are the important things I would say. I would also add one final thing, sorry guys, is that I think this is really important. So use all of these tips. I would encourage listeners, writers, use all of these tips because writing concisely is a worthwhile goal.
I'd add to that people might not comment on it, right? If you're able to reduce an email from 200 words to 150 to make it more concise, to make it work better, people are probably not going to reply saying, hey, great email. Thanks for, being so brief. But they will appreciate it. It will make your writing more effective. So if you can use less, if that's right for the type of writing that you're producing, then go for it.
Pete, final thoughts?
So just if you don't keep your writing concise, if you have a lot of fluff, you're also risking that people are not going to finish, reading the valuable message that you have to say, right? So if you want people to read the whole of your piece, then definitely follow these tips.
Always remember that reader. Yeah, maybe that's a good topic for a future episode is audience, consideration of audience.
Definitely.
We'll have to brainstorm some ideas for our next episode. Okay, guys, we'll have a great rest of your September, your new beginnings or spring, and see you next time.
You betcha.
Bye. See you guys.
Bye, guys.
Bye.